June 6, 1944, Normandy, France. The night was quiet, too quiet. In the still darkness, German soldiers guarding the hedgerows near Sainte-Mère-Église heard the faint hum of engines rolling across the sky. It was nothing unusual at first. Allied bombers had been crossing France for months. Most of the men stayed in their trenches, smoking in silence, waiting for the sound to fade. But it didn't fade. It grew, louder, closer, until the entire sky began to tremble. Searchlights pierced the darkness. What they revealed froze the German sentries in disbelief. The night sky was full of parachutes. Hundreds of them, thousands, drifting like white ghosts against the moonlight. Within seconds, tracer fire ripped upward. Anti-aircraft guns blazed from the fields, but the sky only filled with more. C-47 transport planes roared overhead, dropping men into the countryside, onto roads, behind villages, even into the marshes. The Germans shouted into their radios, but most lines were dead. No one knew what was happening. All they knew was this: the enemy wasn't attacking from the sea. The enemy was falling from the sky, right behind them. The invasion of Europe had begun in the dark. By the spring of 1944, the Second World War had entered its fifth and most critical year. The Allies were preparing to strike at the very heart of Hitler's fortress Europe. The plan, Operation Overlord, was the most ambitious military undertaking in history. An invasion across the English Channel to liberate France and open a Western front against Nazi Germany. But for the invasion to succeed, one brutal fact was clear. The Allied troops landing on the beaches could not survive if German reinforcements arrived too quickly. The coastal defenses could be breached, but if panzer divisions counterattacked before the beachheads were secure, the entire operation would collapse into the sea. That's where the American paratroopers came in. 218 key elite divisions, the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne, were tasked with an impossible mission. Hours before the first landing craft reached Normandy's beaches, these men would drop by parachute into enemy territory, deep behind German lines. Their job: seize key roads, destroy bridges, block enemy movement, and sow confusion through the German rear. It was a plan that demanded not only courage, but perfection. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, more than 13,000 paratroopers boarded over 1,000 C-47 transport planes in southern England. Each man carried up to 70 pounds of equipment: rifles, grenades, demolition charges, radios, and rations, packed so tightly that some struggled even to stand. The aircraft took off in waves, forming massive columns that stretched across the English coast and out over the Channel. Below, the sea was already alive with the movement of Allied landing fleets, steaming toward Normandy's beaches. Above, the sky buzzed with the wings of the Airborne Armada, the largest ever assembled. But this was no ordinary flight. They would be flying through darkness, fog, and anti-aircraft fire, navigating by stopwatch and compass. Each formation had to hit precise drop zones scattered across the Normandy countryside. Small fields, villages, and hedgerows surrounded by flooded marshes. For the men of the 82nd and 101st, the stakes were beyond comprehension. If they missed their zones, they could land miles from their units. If they were spotted, they could be surrounded within minutes. And if the beaches failed below them, they would be stranded, isolated, and alone. Yet, despite the risks, their morale was unshakable. These were the men trained for chaos, soldiers taught to fight in the dark, to adapt, and to survive no matter where they landed. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Channel, the German 7th Army manned its defensive positions across Normandy. To them, this night seemed ordinary. They had been on alert for months, but German high command believed the Allied invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Many senior officers were away from the front, including Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had returned to Germany for his wife's birthday. The Germans expected a naval bombardment, not the silent approach of paratroopers in the dark. In the next few hours, that false sense of calm would be shattered forever. Across occupied France, the German military machine appeared confident. The Atlantic Wall, a vast network of bunkers, minefields, and gun emplacements, was supposed to make any Allied landing suicidal. German propaganda called it impenetrable. The men who manned it believed it. But what the Germans didn't know was that the Allies were already behind that wall, in the sky. Shortly after midnight, the first formations of C-47 transport planes reached the Normandy coast. The moon was hidden by clouds, and below them, the fields of France were invisible in the darkness. As the pilots descended to 600 feet, the night exploded. Flak guns from the German 7th Army opened fire, filling the air with tracer rounds and black bursts of shrapnel. Paratroopers inside the planes could hear the metallic clang of shells ripping through the fuselage. One aircraft burst into flames and disappeared into the sea. Another was torn apart mid-air, scattering men and equipment into the fields below. The sky became chaos, aircraft swerving, pilots losing formation, jump lights flickering red to green in the smoke. One by one, the paratroopers jumped. Some landed exactly where they were supposed to, near Sainte-Mère-Église, La Fière Bridge, and the Murderette River. Most didn't. Strong winds, poor visibility, and anti-aircraft fire scattered the formations across tens of miles. Some men landed alone in flooded swamps, others in hedgerows or even directly on top of German positions. To the Germans below, it seemed like madness. Reports flooded into headquarters. Enemy soldiers spotted near every road, every farmhouse, every field. German officers initially dismissed the messages as panic. Surely there couldn't be paratroopers everywhere. But within an hour, the truth became undeniable. All across the Cotentin Peninsula, small groups of Americans were appearing, cutting phone lines, blowing up bridges, ambushing convoys. Entire communication networks went dark. German supply columns found themselves blocked by wrecked trucks or disabled bridges. Units couldn't reach each other. Command posts couldn't get reports from the front. The German 91st Air Division, responsible for defending the area, was thrown into total confusion. Its commander, General Wilhelm Falley, was killed when his staff car ran into an American ambush. A single squad of paratroopers who had landed miles from their assigned drop zone. By 3:00 a.m., German command was in chaos. Many officers still believed the airborne attack was merely a diversion, a prelude to a larger invasion somewhere else. Adolf Hitler, asleep at his headquarters in Berchtesgaden, could not be awakened to authorize the release of armored reinforcements. Meanwhile, on the ground, German soldiers began to grasp the terrifying reality. They were surrounded, not by an army marching toward them, but by one that had fallen from the sky. The old rules of warfare had been broken. The front line no longer existed. The invaders could be anywhere, in the woods, the barns, the villages, or the very fields they were defending. And when dawn came, it would bring the greatest invasion in human history. The airborne drops over Normandy were not just acts of daring. They were tactical masterpieces built on months of planning and bitter lessons learned in Sicily and Italy. For Operation Overlord, the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were assigned a simple but decisive task: disrupt the Germans' ability to respond to the beach landing. The paratroopers were to secure causeways, destroy bridges, and seize crossroads that the enemy would need to move reinforcements to the coast. But the genius of the operation lay in its unpredictability. Instead of attacking in one concentrated mass, the paratroopers were scattered across dozens of drop zones. On paper, it looked like chaos. In practice, it created exactly what the Allies intended: utter confusion behind German lines. By 2:00 a.m., German commanders had no idea how many enemy soldiers had landed or where they were. Reports came from every direction. Enemy near Cotentin. Enemy near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. Enemy near the Murderette. The paratroopers, some alone, some in small groups, fought like ghosts. Wherever they landed, they acted. If they found a bridge, they destroyed it. If they found a road, they blocked it. If they found a German patrol, they ambushed it. Many of these men were cut off from their units. But that didn't matter. The airborne training emphasized initiative over orders. Each man knew the mission's goal, even if he didn't know his exact position. A single squad of American paratroopers could paralyze an entire German column simply by creating doubt, by making the enemy think a larger force was nearby. By dawn, the Germans had lost their ability to move freely. The 91st Air Division's headquarters had been wiped out. Roads were clogged with wrecked vehicles and frightened soldiers. In several cases, German reinforcements turned back, believing they were surrounded. It was one of the first examples in modern warfare where psychological impact outweighed numbers. The result? By the time the main landings began on Utah Beach, the Germans were no longer a coordinated defense. They were a disoriented collection of isolated units. What made this operation possible was a machine that, until then, had never been used on such a scale. The Douglas C-47 Skytrain. Rugged, fast, and capable of carrying 28 fully armed paratroopers. The C-47 was the lifeline of the Allied airborne forces. That night, more than 2,000 aircraft filled the sky over the English Channel. Each plane carried not just soldiers, but hope and chaos. The pilots, flying through heavy flak and blinding fog, relied on primitive navigation instruments. Some were hit and caught fire. Others dropped their men miles from their intended targets. But in an unexpected way, that failure became one of the mission's greatest strengths. Instead of predictable, concentrated drops, the Germans found themselves facing hundreds of small enemy units. Scattered across a 30-mile front, the very inaccuracy of the drops made the Americans unpredictable. Supporting the paratroopers were hundreds of gliders, silent wooden aircraft towed behind C-47s and released over the countryside. These gliders carried jeeps, mortars, anti-tank guns, and small squads of engineers. Many crashed violently upon landing, but those that survived provided the airborne forces with firepower far beyond what a paratrooper could carry on his back. This fusion of man and machine represented a turning point in warfare. For the first time, an army had the ability to place an entire division deep behind enemy lines overnight, not by marching, not by tanks, but by air. The Germans, who had once pioneered airborne operations in the early years of the war, now watched in disbelief as the Allies perfected the very tactic they had abandoned after the 1941 Crete disaster. To the Wehrmacht officers on the ground, it seemed impossible that so many aircraft could cross their defenses undetected and land troops everywhere at once. When survivors of the first German patrols stumbled back into command posts, their stories sounded like hallucinations. American soldiers are in the orchards. They're blowing up bridges. They're everywhere. For the first time, the Luftwaffe could do nothing. Allied air superiority had rendered the night sky a one-way street into France. Amid the machines and the maps were the men themselves, cold, terrified, but unflinchingly determined. Many were barely 20 years old. Some had never even been to France before that night. Yet, when they jumped from those planes, they became part of one of the most audacious gambles in military history. The paratroopers were trained for total independence. They were told to land, regroup if possible, and complete the mission at any cost. In practice, that meant fighting in small groups, sometimes with strangers from other regiments, often without officers or radios. Some were lucky, landing in open fields where they could cut themselves free and run. Others weren't. Men dropped into trees, into flooded marshes, onto rooftops. Several drowned before they could unclip their chutes. Others landed right in the middle of German positions, fighting for their lives before they even hit the ground. Yet across Normandy, one truth emerged. The scattered Americans adapted faster than their enemy could react. Groups of 5 or 6 men, sometimes just 2, moved through the hedgerows, blowing up road signs, ambushing patrols, cutting phone wires, and spreading terror among German outposts. A German lieutenant later recalled, "We didn't know where the front was anymore. They were behind us, beside us, in our fields. The night itself had turned against us." The paratroopers didn't just win through firepower. They won through confusion, speed, and initiative, turning a night of chaos into the foundation of victory. For the German defenders, the hours between midnight and dawn on June 6, 1944, were pure disorientation. The Atlantic Wall had been designed to face the sea, not the sky. No one in their high command had imagined that a full-scale invasion could begin behind their lines. At first, officers thought they were under attack by small commando teams. Then came the reports. American troops near Sainte-Mère-Église, near Cotentin, near Pont-l'Abbé. Entire units were sending conflicting messages, claiming they were surrounded or overrun. One officer radioed in panic, "They are everywhere!" The German 91st Air Division, responsible for the region, tried to regroup, but its commander, General Wilhelm Falle, never made it. While driving to his headquarters near Picoville at dawn, his convoy was ambushed by a handful of lost paratroopers, men who weren't even supposed to be there. Falle was killed instantly. The loss decapitated local command at the very moment when coordination was most needed. Meanwhile, German reinforcements from Cherbourg and Cotentin found their roads blocked, bridges destroyed, trees felled, road signs removed or turned around. They couldn't tell where the front line was. Everywhere they turned, the enemy was already there. For the Wehrmacht, trained in structure and discipline, this kind of warfare was intolerable. The paratroopers fought without front lines, without orders, without fear of isolation. It was a kind of combat the Germans couldn't understand and couldn't stop. One captured German sergeant later told his interrogators, "We thought the invasion would come from the sea. Instead, it came from above and from behind us." That single sentence summed up the shock of that night. The Germans had prepared for an invasion. They had not prepared for chaos. The Airborne operation's success depended not just on courage, but on leadership. Leadership that could thrive in uncertainty. At the center of it were two men, Major General Maxwell D. Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne Division, and Brigadier General James M. Gavin, commanding the 82nd Airborne. Both were young, aggressive, and unafraid to fight alongside their men. Taylor was known for his calm under fire, Gavin for his ability to inspire in the darkest situations. On D-Day, neither man had the luxury of clear communication. Radio interference, scattered drops, and sheer chaos meant every decision had to be made in the field, often within seconds. Taylor, landing miles from his intended drop zone, quickly gathered stray soldiers and led them personally toward their objectives. Gavin did the same, moving from village to village, rallying isolated paratroopers into makeshift platoons. By dawn, both divisions, though scattered and bloodied, were functioning, not as organized brigades, but as hundreds of independent strike teams. That flexibility was what broke the German defense. The Americans didn't wait for orders. They acted on instinct and initiative, the very qualities that Hitler's army, bound by strict hierarchy, lacked. This contrast in command philosophy revealed one of the deepest divides in the war. Where German soldiers waited for permission, American paratroopers created their own opportunity. Where German doctrine demanded control, the airborne troops thrived in chaos. Gavin would later write, "We were scattered from hell to breakfast, but we owned the night." And indeed, they did. Beneath the tactics and strategy, the Normandy drops exposed a brutal psychological truth. War had entered a new dimension, one where fear itself became a weapon. The Germans had always relied on order, on knowing where the enemy was and how to counter him. The airborne assault stripped that away. Every sound in the darkness became suspect. A twig snapping, a shadow moving, a whisper in English carried by the wind. For soldiers used to linear fronts, this was terror of a new kind, a war with no direction. For the American paratroopers, fear was constant too, but it became fuel. Many jumped into Normandy believing they wouldn't survive. Yet that very fatalism gave them power. They fought as if already dead, turning every encounter into a test of will. One private from the 101st later recalled, "When I hit the ground, I couldn't see a thing. Just voices, gunfire, and shadows. I thought I was alone until someone whispered, 'Screaming eagles, right?' And then I wasn't afraid anymore." That sense of brotherhood, of shared chaos, held them together through the long night. For the Germans, however, the shock was demoralizing. Entire companies withdrew simply because they didn't know where the enemy was. Commanders couldn't trust their maps, their phones, or even their scouts. The battlefield had become a maze, and every corner hid an invisible enemy. By dawn, fear had done what bullets could not. The German front in western Normandy, stretched, disoriented, and leaderless, was already cracking. And at that very moment, as paratroopers held crossroads and blocked roads, the rumble of naval guns could be heard from the coast. The beaches were waiting, and because of the men who fell from the sky, they would be ready. June 6, 1944, Audod 02:30 a.m. The French countryside was burning. The scattered glow of tracer rounds flashed through the hedgerows like lightning. The sounds were disorienting, the low thrum of engines, the crack of rifle fire, the distant thud of explosion. For the German defenders, it felt like the world had turned upside down. In the skies above Sainte-Mère-Église, hundreds of parachutes still drifted through the darkness. Many Americans landed miles off course, but what looked like disaster from the air became chaos for the Germans on the ground. They couldn't tell where the main attack was coming from, or even how many soldiers they were facing. Some paratroopers landed in open fields and were cut down immediately. Others fell into ditches or marshes and crawled through mud to safety. Dozens found themselves trapped in trees, firing from the branches until German bullets silenced them. But everywhere they landed, the fight began instantly. Outside Sainte-Mère-Église, a group from the 82nd Airborne found themselves surrounded by German patrols. Their radios were useless, maps unreadable in the dark. Their commander, a young lieutenant, gave a single order: "We hold right here." They dug into a ditch and began returning fire, cutting down the first wave of German infantry with grenades and machine guns. In the confusion, the defenders had no idea they were facing just 8 Americans. Believing it was a full company, they called for reinforcements that never came, their roads already blocked by other paratroopers miles away. Across the region, this pattern repeated itself. Small groups of airborne soldiers fought like phantom battalions, appearing, striking, and vanishing again. The more the Germans resisted, the more their lines fractured. At Sainte-Mère-Église, the fighting was chaos incarnate. A German flare fired into the night illuminated dozens of parachutes still descending over the town. The defenders opened fire, turning the sky into a storm of tracers. But several paratroopers landed right inside the town square, behind German positions, and began returning fire from rooftops and doorways. The church in the town's center burned from a bomb strike. One paratrooper, Private John Steele, became tangled in the church steeple, hanging helplessly for hours while watching the firefight below. His boots swung in the firelight as the streets below filled with gunfire, explosions, and confusion. The Germans were fighting shadows. By dawn, small groups of Americans had begun to link up, forming ad hoc platoons around Sainte-Mère-Église and Fière Bridge. With only a fraction of their intended forces, they held the roads leading from Cotentin and Cherbourg, cutting off German movement toward Utah Beach. The German 709th Division, which should have reinforced the coastal defenses, found itself trapped by roadblocks and destroyed bridges. Their commanders sent frantic messages to headquarters. "We are under attack from all directions!" But no one could tell where the Americans were, or how many of them existed. The irony was devastating. The paratroopers had been scattered too widely to form a unified force, but that very scattering had created the illusion of an enormous invasion force deep behind German lines. By 5 a.m., the German officers in the Cotentin Peninsula had lost all control. Every report contradicted the next. Every order came too late. As dawn broke over the hedgerows, the sound of the sea reached the inland fields, the distant thunder of naval guns. The paratroopers didn't know it yet, but the beach landings had begun, and because of their chaos, those beaches would not be met by the full force of the German army. As the first rays of dawn broke over Normandy, the fog lifted from the marshes, revealing a landscape that looked like another planet. Wrecked gliders lay scattered across fields. Burning C-47s smoldered in hedgerows. Parachutes fluttered from trees and telephone wires. And among the smoke and debris, American paratroopers were everywhere, muddy, exhausted but still moving. Near Sainte-Mère-Église, small groups of the 82nd and 101st Airborne began consolidating. They had spent the night fighting in total isolation. Now, at last, they could hear the voices of other Americans shouting through the fog. Officers with hand-drawn maps started pulling men from different regiments together, forming improvised platoons. Radios were unreliable, so runners sprinted through the fields carrying updates scrawled on scraps of paper. By 6:20 a.m., The town of Sainte-Mère-Église, one of the first French towns liberated in the invasion, was under American control. The paratroopers had seized its crossroads, cut off German reinforcements from Cherbourg, and secured the road leading to Utah Beach. The Germans, reeling from the shock of the night, tried to regroup. Columns of reinforcements from the 91st Air Division and 6th Parachute Regiment moved toward the front, only to be ambushed at every turn. Bridges were gone, crossroads mined, and roads blocked by felled trees. Snipers and bazooka teams harassed every convoy. The paratroopers, despite being low on ammunition and scattered across unfamiliar terrain, fought with ferocity. They were outnumbered, but they had something the Germans didn't: initiative. They didn't wait for perfect orders. They acted. If they couldn't destroy a bridge, they blocked it. If they couldn't hold a road, they made it impassable. If they couldn't reach their unit, they created a new one. This adaptability was what turned the tide. At La Fière Bridge, one of the most crucial crossings in Normandy, paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne held their ground against repeated counterattacks. German tanks tried to push across, but the bridge had been rigged with explosive. When the lead panzer attempted to cross, the Americans blew it sky high. The explosion echoed for miles, a signal to both sides that the Americans were still in control. From the German perspective, it was incomprehensible. An entire army seemed to have materialized overnight, one that didn't follow conventional rule. Officers tried to piece together what had happened. Some believed hundreds of paratroopers had landed. Others insisted it was tens of thousands. The truth was far smaller, but the psychological impact was enormous. In the midst of this chaos, Adolf Hitler was finally awakened. Furious at being disturbed, he initially refused to believe that Normandy was the real invasion, convinced that the main attack would come later at Pas de Calais. His hesitation proved fatal. While he withheld the powerful panzer divisions that could have crushed the beachheads, the Americans behind the lines had already ensured that the German road network was paralyzed. By 8:00 a.m., the first waves of landing craft reached Utah Beach. The paratroopers' mission to secure the exits and block reinforcements was already a success. As the sun climbed higher, soldiers coming ashore could see paratroopers waving signal panels from the dune, guiding them inland. What had begun as chaos in the dark had become one of the most successful airborne operations in history. The Germans had expected a wall of steel at the coast. Instead, their wall had collapsed from within, dismantled by men who fell from the sky. The first phase of D-Day was over, but the German army, humiliated and enraged, was already preparing to strike back. By mid-morning on June 6, 1944, the battlefield of Normandy was a living storm. The once quiet hedgerows were now tangled with smoke, twisted metal, and the bodies of soldiers from both sides. Yet amid that destruction, the American airborne divisions had achieved the impossible. The 82nd and 101st Airborne, two divisions that had begun the night scattered and disoriented, now held a firm line across the Cotentin Peninsula. Their primary mission was complete. They had secured the key causeways leading inland from Utah Beach, blocking German reinforcements from reaching the shore. When the first amphibious waves from the beaches linked up with the paratroopers that afternoon, it was like two worlds colliding. The soldiers who had stormed the coast and those who had fallen from the sky meeting on the same dirt roads, both stunned that the other was still alive. For the Germans, the psychological damage was immense. Their commanders were stunned not only by the scale of the Allied air assault, but by its speed and precision. Despite terrible losses, the paratroopers had accomplished every major objective that mattered. Bridges that could have been used to rush panzer reinforcements south were either destroyed or under American control. The 91st Air Division was shattered, leaderless, divided, and unable to regroup. In some areas, German soldiers were seen abandoning vehicles and fleeing into the countryside, convinced the entire region had been overrun. Meanwhile, German communication lines were in ruins. The telephone network had been cut in dozens of places, field radios jammed by Allied interference. The once efficient Wehrmacht system, built on order, control, and hierarchy, had been replaced by uncertainty and fear, and above them, the Allies continued to dominate the skies. Fighter planes strafed roads and convoys, making any daylight movement impossible. Even the most experienced German officers were forced to admit that the Atlantic Wall, once thought impregnable, had been fatally compromised from within. As the afternoon wore on, small skirmishes turned into brutal fights for survival. Paratroopers held isolated villages against tanks and infantry until artillery from the beachheads could reach them. Entire German units were forced into retreat by tiny pockets of American resistance. In one sector near Cotentin, paratroopers from the 101st Airborne fought off 3 separate counterattacks using nothing but captured German weapons. They were running low on ammunition, food, and water, but they refused to surrender ground. When night fell again, the Germans withdrew, leaving the Americans in control of the crossroad. That night, German commanders finally realized the full scope of the invasion. Reconnaissance flights confirmed hundreds of Allied ships anchored off Normandy, and landing craft stretching from horizon to horizon. By then, it was far too late. The paratroopers had already sealed the fate of the region. The success of the airborne assault didn't just open the beaches, it shattered the myth of German invincibility. For years, Hitler's armies had advanced relentlessly across Europe. Now, for the first time, they had been caught off guard, overwhelmed, and beaten on their own occupied soil. The fear that once belonged to the conquered now belonged to the conquerors. When the smoke finally cleared over Normandy, the scale of what had happened became undeniable. The Germans had not simply been attacked, they had been outmaneuvered, outthought, and outpaced. By the morning of June 7th, German divisions that were supposed to crush the invasion were still immobilized, trapped in the confusion that the airborne troops had created the night before. Bridges were gone, command posts destroyed, and the roads leading south from Cherbourg and east from Cotentin were littered with wrecked trucks and burnt-out tanks. Reports from German field commanders painted a grim picture. The Americans came from nowhere, one officer wrote. We fought the shadows, and they killed us. In just 24 hours, the American paratroopers had transformed the battlefield. Their success at Sainte-Mère-Église, Fière Bridge, and the surrounding causeways allowed Utah Beach to link up seamlessly with the inland operation. What could have been a massacre on the beaches turned instead into a breakthrough. The statistics tell the story of a miracle wrapped in tragedy. Of the 13,000 American paratroopers who jumped into Normandy that night, more than 2,500 were killed, wounded, or captured within the first day. Entire sticks of men vanished into the darkness, lost in swamps, shot in the air, or killed before touching the ground. And yet, despite the losses, the mission succeeded beyond expectation. Captured German officers could hardly believe the outcome. They had assumed the airborne drops were small-scale raids meant to distract their defenses. Only later did they realize they had faced entire divisions, soldiers who had landed, fought, and held ground where none should have been able to survive. One Wehrmacht major later admitted during interrogation, "We thought they were madmen. They dropped into the middle of our army, and by dawn, it was we who were surrounded." This shock went beyond tactics. It cut to the core of the German psyche. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had failed to prevent the largest airborne invasion in history. The Wehrmacht, once the symbol of precision, had been thrown into confusion by small, scattered units of paratroopers who barely knew where they were. For the Allies, the victory validated years of painful lessons. The chaos of Operation Husky in Sicily, where misdrops had caused disaster, now became the model for success. The paratroopers' ability to improvise under fire had turned what looked like a catastrophic scatter into a devastating weapon. The psychological effect rippled far beyond Normandy. For the first time, the German people heard the words they had long feared. The Allies have landed. But the most shocking part of the news was not that the invasion had come. It was how it had come. The stories of soldiers falling from the sky in the dead of night spread through occupied France like wildfire. Civilians whispered of the ghosts from the air, men who appeared out of darkness, liberated villages, and vanished before dawn. Even Hitler, in his rage, recognized that something fundamental had changed. The fortress he had promised to defend was breached not by tanks or artillery, but by the agility of a new kind of warfare. By June 8th, The American paratroopers had linked with armored reinforcements pushing inland. The bridgeheads at Utah and Omaha were secure. The Germans had lost more than territory. They had lost initiative, confidence, and the myth of invulnerability. The invasion of Europe was irreversible. The men who had fallen through the darkness had opened the road to victory. The night of June 6, 1944, changed the nature of war forever. Before that night, armies advanced in lines, defended by maps, fortifications, and frontiers. After that night, all those boundaries dissolved. The idea that safety could be found behind one's own defenses, that the enemy would attack from the front, died in the hedgerows of Normandy. For the German troops who watched paratroopers drift down from the sky, it was more than a military shock. It was a psychological collapse. They had been trained to fight predictable wars, battles of position and control. But the Americans fought differently. They came in scattered groups, uncoordinated yet unstoppable. They improvised, adapted, and turned chaos into momentum. In just a few hours, these airborne soldiers had achieved what no bombardment could. They broke the enemy's sense of order. Many historians later called D-Day a triumph of engineering and logistics. And it was. But behind every bridge taken and every road secured were ordinary men who made extraordinary decisions. Men who landed alone in the dark, surrounded by enemies, and still moved toward the sound of gunfire, because they knew others were doing the same. It was that unity, born not from command, but from conviction, that defined the victory. For the Germans, the lesson was devastating but clear. The era of rigid warfare was over. The enemy they faced now could strike from the air, fight without supply lines, and survive without orders. It was the dawn of a new kind of soldier and a new kind of war. By the end of D-Day, the beaches were secure, the bridgeheads were held, and the men who had fallen from the night sky stood on French soil as the first wave of Europe's liberation. The world would remember the tanks, the ships, the generals, and the beaches. But it was those few thousand men who fell into darkness and fought in chaos who made the light of freedom possible again.